Welcome to Art Lounge.
So, what's Art Lounge? It's a space for artists, ones aspiring, or those who enjoy it, to come together and share ideas, thoughts, expression, and creation. So whether you're an illustrator, a writer, a musician, sculptor, comedian, dancer, architect, or someone who enjoys art in general, this space is for you. I'll be streaming daily with a mix of content, and in the near future, I'll be announcing different opportunities for you to participate in. So stick around. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Drawing Comics stream. For this half of the stream, I'm going to be copying John Buscema's Conan the Barbarian. And some of you might ask why copies work, and we'll get to that. It's a great question. But first, let's take a look at a 5-minute reel talking about who John Buscema was. John Buscema was born in New York City in 1927. At a young age, he showed interest in drawing, copying comic strips, particularly the classic Popeye the Sailor. After graduating Manhattan's High School of Music and Art, Buscema took night lessons at Pratt Institute, as well as classes at the Brooklyn Museum for life drawing. For some time, he also trained as a boxer, where he began painting portraits of fighters and sold cartoons to the Hobo News. Seeking work as a commercial illustrator while doing various odd jobs, Buscema found himself instead entering the comic book field in 1948, landing a job with the famous Stan Lee. Comic book artist and historian Jim Steranko wrote, "In order to adapt to the Marvel comic style of superhero adventure, Buscema synthesized the essence of Jack Kirby's supercharged action figures, harrowing perspectives, monolithic structures, and mythological planescapes into a formula that instantly integrated into his own superbly crafted vision." The process brought Buscema's art to life in a way that it had never been before. Anatomically balanced figures of Herculean proportions stalked, stormed, sprawled, and savaged their way across Marvel's universe like none had previously. Buscema's work was extremely prolific. He's best known for his run on the series The Avengers, The Silver Surfer, and over 200 stories featuring the sword and sorcery hero Conan the Barbarian. In addition, he penciled at least one issue of nearly every major Marvel title, including long runs on 2 of the company's top magazines, Fantastic Four and Thor. Buscema would pencil an average of 2 comics a month in collaboration with various inkers, including his brother, Sal Buscema, who recalled, "This guy used to eat, sleep, and breathe drawing. It didn't matter what was going on around him. He would get bored with it and start sketching. he just couldn't stop drawing. In his later years, Buscema lived in Port Jefferson, New York, in Long Island. He was married and had 2 kids. On January 10th, 2002, John Buscema passed away from stomach cancer. He was 74. But despite this untimely death, John Buscema's love and dedication for drawing lives on to inspire many. What an amazing artist, right? I mean, just looking at those slides and seeing Savage, the poses there, the drama that each character, it's not just the main character himself, but all the characters around him and how well they're drawn. And the background itself, it's so dynamic. That drawing of Wolverine, though not too many lines, but anatomically correct. There's such expression in his face, that rage. It really captured that well. Not just in his face, but also the pose of Wolverine. It's still amazing. I look at that and I'm just marveled at how well he's able to do that, and in such confident strokes and anatomy. That's absolutely amazing. But yeah, so going back to the original question, I kind of answered it there. Why copies work? Really, it's mainly to get myself more and more familiar with drawing comics and drawing comic book pages and panels. And there's so much benefit to it. I think everybody should take that direction if they're learning comics or if they're starting out to draw. It's a great way to practice all those skills all at once. Not only are you learning better hand-eye coordination, you're training your muscle memory and kind of making your hand more flexible by being able to draw all these lines that are there for you. You don't have to go from your imagination. You're kind of taking the burden off of having to juggle all those things at once. So it's there for you. What you have to do is just tell yourself that, hey, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to challenge myself to copy this exactly as it is. Not so that you could be exactly like this person, but like I was mentioning, so you could get better at the whole procedure. Especially making your hand more flexible and improving your hand-eye coordination. Because a lot of times when people are starting out, they want to jump into complex drawing and complex figures and all that from the imagination even, and that's pretty intimidating, and at times it's gonna be discouraging what the results are, because you still haven't trained your hand-eye coordination well. Despite you wanting to as badly as you do, your hand isn't as flexible or isn't just used to be able to draw these specific lines. It's kind of stiff. So drawing these comics and even tracing, I really encourage for beginners to do that, to trace work. Get tracing paper, put it over an image that you really enjoy, and just draw it over and over, or draw as many pages or figures or whatever it is that you're really into over and over and over again, so that you could make your hand more flexible, for your hand to be able to draw these specific lines and figures and features, etc. So and then you could challenge yourself step by step. It's a lot easier to trace than it is to copy, but it's a stepping stone. It's somewhere to start. It's something that's gonna actually give you some pleasant results. You don't have to sit there and spend all that time and get really frustrated and then leave. At least if you're gonna spend that time and you're gonna try to trace as much detail as you could see, and yeah, that I think that will be more rewarding in the beginning And then you could challenge yourself even more. If you really want to take it further, you could say, okay, well, I'm doing a tracing now, let me try to copy it. Let me see how well I can get this down without tracing paper, just having it side by side and being able to do that, and challenge yourself there. Be like, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to draw for as many hours as it takes to get it down exactly as it is, with as much erasing as I need to, whatever it takes. At the end, I will get this down as close to every single tiny detail as possible. And that, I think, will really encourage for you to challenge yourself and challenge your abilities to get better and better and better. So first start out with tracing, then moving on to copying, or go in between one or the other. When you get too frustrated with copying and it's not working out as well as you hope, you can go back to tracing to gain your confidence again, and then go back to copying to just continuously try to improve. And that's really what the whole journey is going to be like. Even to this point, if you're really good at drawing, there's still never a point where you're satisfied. And you'll hear a lot of artists talk about that, a lot of illustrators talking about that, where despite them having lots of issues out, or whatever it is, they still have more challenges that they want to accomplish and surpass. And I think that's something that it's better to embrace from the beginning and enjoy, and look at that as the journey, really, and the fun in it, than just focusing on the results. And because that could be discouraging as well if you're starting out. If you're new and you're not getting good results, a lot of times people get frustrated and they just stop. They stop practicing, or they don't find the motivation in it. But keep in mind that it is a stepping process, like a stepping stone process. You will eventually get better and better. And that's one of the beneficial things of having a sketchbook, not just loose paper around. You have a sketchbook, and you could always look back, and you could be like, okay, like 3 months from now, I'm going to look back and I'm going to see how much I've improved. And most definitely, if you challenge yourself, if you're persistent enough, you will see the amount of progress that you've made. So it's great to copy, and it brings up another important point, where there's a difference between copying and plagiarism. And I think a lot of you already know, but for some who are just starting out or not too familiar with it, it's frowned upon. And I personally don't think it's right. I think that you should find your own voice. That's the biggest reward of taking on this challenge, is that you eventually find your own style, your own way of expressing, and something that when you look at it, you could be like, yeah, that really is me. Or when people look at the work and they're like, oh, I know this person, that's their work. That's such a rewarding aspect. You don't want to go through it and knowing that I'm really actually copying somebody else's hard work, and I'm not really capable of doing it myself. That's not a great feeling. And why do that? If you're going to get to a point where you are drawing just like whoever it is that you're trying to copy, you already acquired a really amazing skill. It's why you chose their work to begin with, right? So if you get to a point where you're drawing just like them, take the next challenge. You challenged yourself so far. You've put in all that time, all that effort to be able to copy it. Take the time and effort and challenge to develop your own thing. I think influences are okay, but if you're looking at somebody's work and you're trying to figure out if it's if it's this person or the other, it's not good. I don't really agree with that. I do see some artists in the industry who are actually very successful, quote unquote. They're pumping out issue after issue of work, and in the beginning I would look at their work and I'm like, wait, is this person's work? it seems a little bit, like a tiny bit different. The difference is almost, it's enough for me to be able to be like, hey, is this person's work or not? And then I would research and I would find out that the name is totally different, and I would see a lot of their work and it's almost identical to the other artists that I know. And you're kind of like, why do that? You're good to a point where you're pumping out issues. Create your own voice, do that challenge, create that challenge for yourself, come up with your own style. And it's so rewarding too once you get to a point where you know that you found something that you really like, that connects with you, it resonates with your image, and you know that it's not like somebody else's work or whatever. It's an incredibly rewarding feeling and challenge to get yourself to that point. But yeah, going back to this idea, it's just a tool to improve your ability to draw. There are things to take away from it, and I've noticed that I've done that myself too, where I would draw something and I'd be like, oh, I really like how he does this, but then I would grasp the general idea of it. For instance, if it's anatomy, you could understand that instead of just drawing two straight lines for, let's say, the bicep, I've learned how to draw the bicep from this person, and then from there you could change a little bit about it here and there to just kind of suit your own taste or your own aesthetic, and work with it and play with it until you kind of mold it to be what you like to do. So there's multiple benefits to it. You learn the process of how quickly you would need to do certain things, like should you jump into the detail on the first panel that you sketch out, or should you sketch out the entire page and then get into detail on each? And I think personally the latter is better. I think it's better to try to sketch out the entire page, but you'll see me making the mistake of sometimes going into detail a little bit too soon. But in general, sketching out, I think, is one of the best good habits that you could teach yourself in the beginning. And this is something that I've mentioned in the basics stream before this one, where I talk about what are some of the great habits that you can teach yourself, and that is for sure the number one good habit is to teach yourself how to sketch things out and to keep it light. You don't want to commit to detail immediately and then find out that all that detail, all that time that you spent on this panel, character, page, whatever, ends up not fitting in. The figure doesn't fit into the panel, or the pages aren't lining up properly, or whatever it is that you want to draw in each panel ends up to bleeding off into another one. That's not great. So it's better to just teach yourself the good habit of sketching things out first, giving yourself a framework to know, okay, now I know this is definitely going to fit in. Let me dive to the next stage, putting in a little bit more detail, pressing a little bit harder. And I think also another great thing to do is if you're carrying around a notepad with you or drawing pad, is to practice shading. Now, it's not just about shading, it's also about having control over how hard you press on the paper with the pencil and getting used to that, having that become ingrained into your memory of having control over the pencil. How hard are you pressing? When it's right to press a little bit more, when it's right to loosen up, and be able to flow between those stages properly. So if you carry around a small notepad with you or a drawing pad and you're sitting somewhere on public transportation, or if you have a break and you're just bored or you need to kill some time, you could just take it out. Something really small that could fit into your pocket or back pocket or small compartment in your book bag, and just practice shading, practice basic shapes, even drawing a perfect circle, something that I mentioned in the previous stream as well. And just all those things end up benefiting you more and more. Even though it's something very simple, it ends up being very rewarding when you're jumping into panels, because you're not struggling with that anymore. You've practiced how to shade properly, and you're able to control your pencil with a lot more ease. You don't immediately jump into like grinding the pencil into the paper because you want to get it down or you want to have more control over it. You've loosened up through all this practice and you feel more confident. So yeah, that's definitely a highly recommended thing to do. Carry around a drawing pad with you. Practice these things. They're simple and they have so much benefit to them. I think another really good thing from drawing comics or copying comics is, obviously, I've mentioned it earlier, but you get to practice all these other elements to drawing. So you're learning how to draw the panels out, like using a ruler, how to use the ruler, which is its own tool, and you definitely want to have a good one with you. I would say a clear ruler is great, because if you're drawing parallel lines, you could see through the ruler and see where the other line is to be able to draw straight. That's something that you'll learn as well as you're practicing with it. The ruler is definitely important. And also you'll learn other things from whoever it is. There's some artists who are absolutely fantastic when it comes to camera angles. And one of my favorite artists, Eduardo Risso, who did 100 Bullets, you guys should check it out if you haven't. Absolutely a great work. And another artist who brings life into drawing through simple lines and just masterful lines. Just a quick stroke and it already breathes life into the character. And he is, he's definitely one of those artists who's capable of doing that as well, along with John Buscema. But when you're copying the work, you're learning things like camera angles, perspectives, backgrounds, how to draw backgrounds. That's also really important. That's something that really took me some time to jump into as well. When I first started out, I focused so much on the characters or like center page pieces, and I spent almost no time practicing background. So when it came down to me drawing comics, me putting out issues, it came to a challenge of like, well, what do I draw in a background? How do I fill the background pages? And granted, sometimes it's best to just have a center focused figure and not having any background, depending on the style, or if you're going to color it and you're just going to give it like a solid color or whatnot. But it shouldn't hide the fact that you haven't put in time in drawing backgrounds. As you could see, there's so many different benefits to it. You do learn how to draw those backgrounds. The next time you sit down to draw a panel, you can have that in your memory. You could be like, oh, I've learned how to draw broken down cars because of this panel that I did. And you could take little pieces from there and play around with that and know how the basic shape of it is and change it around to make it something more personal. And you could do that as well. Face expressions, like all those things are great because you're getting them down and you're ingraining it into your memory. You're growing your library, your visual library, and at the same time understanding the importance of speed. So all these benefits come from drawing from comics. Right, so going back to other benefits that you get from drawing from comics, and I think one of them, and the most probably important one, is motivation. There's a lot of times, this is something that I'm struggling with as well, is finding the motivation to sit and do something. And I think the intimidation comes from maybe not really knowing where to start, right? Not knowing, what's going to come of it, and, just sitting there and wrestling with different ideas. But the good way to really get your creativity flowing is by doing this. Pick a comic book that you really enjoy doing, or you really enjoy reading, or the artist, or the characters, whatever it is, and just focus on that. Just something for you to start with, and from there it can get the creativity flowing. You can start getting more into the drawing, and I find that a lot of the times that's really what happens. It's before actually sitting down to do it, it's this struggle of what's gonna, you're just overthinking it in your head. And then once you sit down, at least for me, once I sit down and I start drawing, I really start getting into it. And then I remind myself this is so much fun. This is great. Learning all this information is great. And you really get into your own head and whatever it is that you're drawing, and everything kind of melts away, and you just sit and focus and just improve over time. So I think that's definitely another great benefit from drawing from comics. I think another cool thing about drawing from comics, and this is probably more of a personal experience, maybe some of you could relate to it, is drawing from comics is kind of like reading a book, right? You're going into the mind of the writer. You're reading what they're creating. You're reading their style of telling a story, and you're within their creativity. And I think drawing is kind of the same way, but instead of reading letters, paragraphs and such, you're doing it with illustration. You're making the same lines that they are. You're kind of taking on the style temporarily and experiencing as he creates each panel, as he creates each character, as he makes each line. Lines vary. Some are angular, some are smooth, some are thick and thin, or whatever it is. So all these things as well are kind of collecting in your creativity palette. You're going through all these different styles, and certain things might rub off on you, some things that you'll enjoy doing. I think that's also just part of the process of you developing your own style, as we were talking about earlier, is you just draw as much as you can. And as was mentioned into that 5-minute reel of John Buscema, he was always drawing every minute that he can. I mean, granted, some people have a lot more busier schedules and they can't or whatever, but any chance that you can get to sit down and draw is time well spent. There is never a point where if you're sitting and drawing, it's just not working out or whatever it is. It's always a great experience, and I think the more you do it, the more it's going to help in developing your own style and getting faster and having more references whenever it is that you're doing your own creation. But I don't think it should take away from also taking time to do things from your imagination. And that's something that I'm also going to be talking about in my next stream, where you guys are going to be able to see more of my personal projects, something that I am doing from my imagination, the whole creativity process from that as well. And I think that's also important, just as much as you sit down and you draw comics, as we were saying before, it should be a motivational tool. It should be a learning process, and it shouldn't take away from time that you spend creating your own content. I think they should both go hand in hand. And it's probably why it's important to try to draw as much as you can within a day, so you can cover all these grounds. You can cover drawing from comics, you could cover drawing from your own imagination, you could take the time to practice basics, just understanding the figure more and practicing from that, as well as drawing from real life. I think that's another absolutely essential tool. And I think, just like comics, drawing from real life is an opportunity for you to learn and improve and not be burdened by wrestling with content. Like, what am I going to draw? Like, if you're going to, for instance, you find a figure that you enjoy or a face that you really enjoy, and you sit there and you practice that, you're not worried like, oh, is this right or whatever. Everything is there for you. You just have to dedicate the time to do it. So if you could spend 2-3 hours a day, that will skyrocket your skills to a new level. And if you do it at least 3 times a week, I'm talking more of like professional level, where you're doing this every day. You're spending at least 4 or 5 hours a day, probably more, definitely more, depending on what your projects are and how much time you have. But yeah, if you're looking to do it professionally, it's gonna pretty much consume your entire day. But if you're starting out, I would say, 2-3 hours trying to fit in all these different exercises would really, you would see improvement a lot faster. I mean, even if you spend like half an hour, each day, if you're starting out, I think you still gain a lot of stuff. I wouldn't underestimate that. As I mentioned, if you dedicate, let's say 30 minutes a day, every day, you will see huge improvements over time from your drawing. And I think a lot of this stuff also, it's probably important to write down as well. I think for me, it's better to have it written down than to sit down and each time be like, what was it that I was supposed to do? What were the things that I'm supposed to keep in mind? How do I improve with this, or what did I learn last time when I was doing this? I think writing and drawing kind of go hand in hand. And I think writing in general is just that absolutely will do wonders for yourself in general, whether it comes to just ideas, writing down ideas that you have that you want to draw later, so that you don't have to, again, spend the time the next day. You wake up and you're going through the motions and you're just like, what did I think of? What was it that I wanted to do? Or even if you might not even remember, you might forget it by the next day because you got so many other priorities. So I think if you sit and write this stuff down, what you've learned, like kind of do a page, I would say a notebook, just have a notebook for ideas, a notebook for drawing, and just write stuff down so that it's a lot faster for you to jump back into it the next time you sit down. If let's say you learned, in order to help yourself with accuracy, you learned about negative spaces, the spaces in between the lines of the legs, for instance, are shapes of their own. And I'll probably demonstrate that a little bit more as we go through the streams and episodes. You guys will see me talking about all these different methods. And again, this is mainly for the introduction. This is for the first time of me streaming. I'm just talking about all this stuff in a nutshell, in a sense. But as we stream, I'll talk about it more, and it'll help you guys as well, hopefully, to remember this stuff and keep it in mind as you're drawing. But yeah, if you're learning, let's say, about negative spaces, and you guys can look that up as well, it allows you to kind of shift your focus. You're going from focusing on these specific lines, and then switching over and seeing like the negative space. Rather than seeing the leg, you're seeing this specific shape between them, and it'll help you kind of draw that in order to ensure that it's accurate, or to ensure that the space in between the legs is closer or better or more accurate. They're all different tools in a sense to help you achieve as much accuracy as possible. And sometimes it's just fun to refresh your perspective, having to focus so much on lines, having to focus so much on anatomy, and then switching over your focus and drawing something in a different light, in a different perspective. And one of the examples of that is when people use mirrors, or they'll, if you're doing it, let's say on Photoshop or other programs, so you'll see some artists flipping the image or mirroring the image to refresh their eyes a bit, and that kind of helps you see where the mistakes are, and that really does help. I've done this plenty of times. I still do it. It kind of snaps you out of this like meticulous mode that you might be in, or if you're wrestling with some part of the face or some part of the body or background, whatever, having to flip the image, you could immediately notice, it's a little bit lopsided, or the eye is a little bit weird, or the nose is a little too low, or whatever it is. And you could kind of recollect yourself and refresh your focus and improve it a little bit more. So, that's another method, mirroring images or studying the negative spaces. And all these different tools will help improve your process. And I think that's important to write down, so that way, let's say you sit down and you'll be like, what was it? Okay, it was negative spaces. I could focus on that. I could focus on thinking of human figures, or the parts of the human figure in basic shape form. I remember I drew cylinders, and the cylinder shape was a lot easier to first start with than rather focusing on like the muscle specifically. Drawing from references, in a sense. All these things would, I think, benefit being written down, as opposed to keeping in mind each time you're doing it. And the more you do it, the more you refer back to the writing, or you refer back to your sketchbook, kind of do like an overview each time you start, the easier it'll become, and it'll be ingrained into your memory. And another example of what happens with that, I mentioned this in the previous stream, in a basics stream, is like tying your shoe. We all started out, and when we were learning it, it was a process, and we had to remember all these specific details and methods of doing it. But as we started doing it more and more and more, we don't think about it anymore, right? It just kind of happens. We sit down, we do it, and it's perfect every time. And the same thing happens with drawing. If you dedicate that time, if you do it over and over and over again, all these ideas, all these different tools that we were just discussing, your hand-eye coordination, your understanding of anatomy, all that becomes this ingrained part in your memory. It just happens after a while. There are artists, and this is also something that I mentioned before, there are artists that did a full circle, where they started out by drawing from some part of the body and, kind of expanding the detail further and further until they finished the drawing, and then realizing, there's a pitfall to it. You end up spending so much time on all this detail, when you get to a certain point, then you realize that other parts of the body are not proportionate. And now you have to go and erase all that detail that you put in and start from scratch. And that's kind of a wasteful time, and it's a little bit discouraging. But yeah, they would start with that. They would start with that method, and they would learn how to do it specifically with all these guidelines and all these different tools in order to ensure that the image comes out right and it's proportionate and the backgrounds are well done, and etc. And then they go right back to doing what they did from the beginning, which is starting from some part of the body. But now that they've understood all these techniques, they understood all these different tools, it's ingrained in them. It's like tying their shoe. They just do it and it comes out right. They start out with, like, let's say the foot, but because all these techniques and everything have been ingrained and they already have a great understanding of all these parts, like they know that the foot is supposed to measure X or have X amount of heads in them, and then from there they can build out, pretty good example of that would be a modern artist by the name of Kim Jung-ji. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, but if you haven't seen his work, I will bring this up right now as an example. Just wanted to show you guys a quick visual of his work, just as an example, and it's also really cool to see him produce all this stuff and how amazing his imagination is, and for him to be able to do all that, especially with just a pen. He's not even using anything to erase this stuff. That's how much I believe this guy draws. It's so ingrained into him. He doesn't even have to take time to think about it. It just connects instantly from his mind's eye out onto his hand and into the paper. But I do believe this is something that pretty much anybody who takes the time to dedicate themselves to drawing will eventually achieve this level. I think that he spent so much time. You don't see. It almost seems magical that this person's capable of doing it. And this kind of goes into this whole idea of talent, where people are saying you're gifted or you're talented, and I don't really believe in that. I think, of course, there are some people who are predisposed to being able to draw really well or play music or be excellent in academics and whatever it is, but it doesn't exclusively mean it's just them or that person or whatever it is. I think pretty much anyone can achieve that if they dedicate themselves to it. One of the best movies to illustrate that, I think, is Amadeus, where you have Mozart, who was a prodigy, who was born with this ability to to play music, and it just comes out of him, and he's prolific about it. And then there's Salieri, who spends all of his time, all of his dedication, and also an amazing musician, creates great music, but because he is caught up by jealousy, and he spends so much time focusing on Mozart and just feeling this weird duality of love and hate. He loves the guy because he's so amazing and prolific, and at the same time he hates him because he wants to be like him. He's so caught up in that he doesn't focus on creating his own work or focus on doing his own thing. He's just constantly thinking about this other person, which I think is a great movie, just talking about the idea of art and how it isn't a competition. It's not about first, second, third, better than or whatever. It's an experience. It's a form of self-expression, and everybody has their own voice. Even if they do share some commonalities or interests or whatever, if people spend enough time doing their work, they'll eventually come out with something that's really great or satisfying, not just for the outside or for whoever it is. It's mainly, and it should be mainly, for themselves to really enjoy. So if you guys haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it. It's a great movie. It's funny, and Robert Downey Jr. plays Amadeus So it's a great film. It really does brush up on all of this idea of being a little bit too preoccupied with others as opposed to being more preoccupied with your work, which is what Amadeus was doing. He spent most of his time just focusing on his work, whereas Salieri was focusing on jealousy, and it just ate him alive. It's something that I don't encourage. I don't like. That's something that also social media, I think, does as well, is that it kind of creates this divide, and people start comparing each other to each other and saying, oh, this person is doing more and this and that and the other, and it becomes toxic. I don't think that's a good mindset for pretty much any artist, for anyone who is in the art field. I'm just not. I am not an advocate for competitiveness and comparison when it comes to this field. Maybe that's something that's good in sports, but I think predominantly pretty much anything that you do, whether it's in academics or if it's in the artistic field, the best competition is with yourself. If you have certain things that you want to achieve, there's nobody better to compare yourself than yourself. If you don't feel like you're achieving enough, tell yourself to do more. And I don't think it's important to have somebody there to compare yourself to and say, well, why can't I do, or why do they, or it becomes toxic, and it becomes what ends up happening to Salieri in a movie. So I think that's pretty much it for this half of the stream, guys. I'm gonna cut it off here. I will be taking a little break, and then I will be streaming again later on today, where I will be doing a personal project of mine, and you guys can see some of the stuff that I'm working on as we go through the stream. In episodes, you guys will see multiple different types of projects that I'll be doing, and stick around. I'll be back. If you guys enjoy this content, subscribe, hit the like button, and you'll get a notification when I'm going to be streaming. That way you guys don't have to wait up. You'll get the email, you'll get the jingle. So thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you guys in the next stream.